Today, hundreds of newspapers across the country are publishing op-eds to push back against the Trump administration's attacks on the press. It started with the Boston Globe, who asked news organizations to come together to condemn the president's attacks on the press as fake news and enemies of the people. While hundreds are participating, some say they have mixed feelings about the movement, including a Baltimore Sun columnist who noted it feeds a narrative that news organizations are aligned against Mr. Trump. With us now is NPR media correspondent David Folkenflik. So, David, what can readers expect to see when they open up the newspapers?
You're going to see newspapers large and small, from Boston to Kokomo, Indiana, to North Dakota, to Missouri, Oklahoma, and all the way across to cities large and small in California, articulating their first principles, explaining why they're not the enemy of the people. They are of the communities they serve. They, in fact, are of the people. This is their argument. And they say, you know, we are fallible. We are mortal. We make mistakes at times. But we're doing the very best we can to reflect your triumphs and your travails. And you know, to call us an enemy of the people and to denigrate what we do is to undermine not only the role that we play, but your own ability to be informed about your communities you live in.
Well, it's an interesting development because typically the news media tries to separate itself from the story. We report on these issues. We try not to become part of the issue. So what do you think drove them to take this unprecedented step?
Well, I think this gentleman right here, the President of the United States, has put the media front and center. If you think back to August 2015, he made Megyn Kelly his opponent rather than the 9 other candidates on the debate stage. He has made the press one of the primary foils. He called them the opposition party in a tweet today that appeared just moments after I'd been live on our air on NPR. And he has managed to try to use them as a foil. It rallies his supporters for, I wouldn't say all Republicans, but for the most hardcore Trump loyalists. This is an enormously energizing thing for him to be able to do. The press typically likes to stand back and say, it's not about us, you know, we'll take the slings and arrows, we'll absorb it. But right now, they feel under threat. And let's talk about a couple of ways. There's the question of being called the enemy of the people is essentially analogous to treason. It's what Soviet leaders used to do in the old days. And so it essentially is a very extreme rhetoric, particularly to come from the Oval Office. The second thing is there's concern about danger. These are not isolated things. You've had anchors and correspondents for major news organizations, NBC, CNN, and others, say they've been targeted with such venom and hate they've gotten death threats. Obviously, you know, the 5 journalists who were killed in Annapolis, including a former colleague and an old friend of mine, and you know, journalists themselves abroad, people that we have known, have been injured and killed covering wars abroad as well. Some of them from my network. The idea that somehow they are being targeted by their own president suggests that perhaps violence can be visited upon them in a way that could be very scary. And this is something that even the publisher of the New York Times articulated to Trump in the meeting earlier this summer.
Well, the presidential wannabes in the last presidential primaries, Democratic congressmen, even Republican congressmen, even former intelligence officials have found out that criticizing the president, coming out against the president, can have pretty extreme consequences. There are some newspapers out there that are saying this is not going to help anything if we do this, so they're withholding those kinds of op-eds.
I've been hearing on my phone and emails and calls from colleagues who are delighted by this and a lot who are very ambivalent, as I myself am in some ways. The idea being that Trump has said, look, this is a united front against me, the opposition party, as he put it this morning. And, you know, to pluck a term from the ether, you know, this is collusion. That is, the press are acting in concert to criticize him. Now, they're using their own words. This isn't quite the same as when Sinclair Broadcast Group issued this edict for hundreds of anchors across the country at their local stations to read the same editorial as though it were in their own words, supporting the president, but by basically criticizing the rest of the press. But there is this sense that even if it's in their own words, that somehow this allows him to point to the press as being oppositional as opposed to performing its watchdog role regardless of who's in the office.
Right. There's part of the population that sees the president's actions as war against the news media, and there's part that sees the news media as being at war against the president, and it is having consequences. I want to read you, Quinnipiac University released a recent poll that said 65% of those polled believe the media is an important part of democracy, but a majority of Republicans agree with the president's claims that the media is the enemy of the people. Again, there's division happening in this country that we have not seen before.
And, well, on this issue, you know, look, this harks back in some ways to what Nixon did with the press, particularly at times his ability to get into office and then his desire to try to deflect crisis. There is an echo, shall we say, a parallel to what's happening here. It certainly helped Trump get here, although without the media, he would never have been a viable candidate. This is a guy who basked in the media here in New York. He essentially grew up in the glare of the tabloids and the Kliegelites of TV and cable, and
manipulated it very well.
Brilliantly, I think, brilliantly. But nonetheless, he has used it time again as a foil. I think that, you know, part of the concern is that the press gets drawn into this and serves an oppositional role. Marty Baron, the executive editor of the Washington Post, keeps saying, we're going to work, we're not going to war. And yet, there can be a moment at which the press is allowed to articulate in its own terms its first principles and why it does what it does. I think with the Quinnipiac poll, with the question of Republicans, a majority saying that they don't look at the press in this way, it's become a tribal issue. Trump has turned this into an us and them. I don't think it's symmetrical. That is, I think that the question of who defines themselves as a Republican right now is influenced by how people feel about the president. And so that's a shifting population. And those who are hunkering down saying we're with him despite the criticisms, despite the investigations, despite the controversies, despite the extreme rhetoric, are more likely to say they're Republican and are more likely, therefore, to say we're on board against the press.
Well, my one concern is if they don't believe the truth as it's presented to them, what will they believe? You don't get to define your own truth, but evidently you can if your name is Donald Trump right now.
Well, there's certainly efforts to shape reality, and the truth at times is a casualty of that.
Very true. David Folkenflik, thank you so much.
You bet.